Hey guys, voice of Beetle Man here, flying at you on my titanium copper composite beetle wings here. Going to be responding today actually. I don't usually do this kind of thing, but maybe I'll start doing it, kind of get dialogue flowing a little bit more. Um, but I'm going to be responding to an older video, actually it was posted in early 2010 by an atheist gentleman named Dan Courtney. Um, Dan posted a video called "The Physics of God Power," um, and this video unfortunately doesn't have hardly any views. At the current time I'm watching it now, 2014, has less than 300 views. It's like 260 some odd views. And it's unfortunate because out of it's an interesting argument. I think it's obviously doesn't work, unfortunately, but it's at least clever. I enjoyed watching it, and it's short and to the point, and so I was like, oh, okay, that's funny. I like it. Um, and so I'm going to be responding to that video today and attempting to show why this objection against the concept of omnipotence, or at least God as a powerful being is incoherent. I'm going to be responding to this argument and hopefully get some dialogue flowing. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so in the first part of this video, he's commenting on a debate between Frank Turek and Christopher Hitchens. Apparently, Turek lists these various attributes that he claims God has, and that he can prove that he has them. Yada yada yada. Well, Dan in this video has a list of them, and I'll list them off here: spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal, powerful, intelligent, moral, and creator. But really the one that we're interested in here is powerful. And then, of course, powerful becomes kind of the central topic, and that involves immaterial, timeless, and spacelessness. Dan he first starts out by pointing out that spaceless, timeless, and immaterial are actually negations. So they describe the opposite property, basically, the absence of spatial presence, the absence of timeless location, and the absence of immateriality. I'm sorry, the absence of materiality, thus being immaterial. So those are the ones we're going to focus on here, and I'll try to keep my video fairly short. The issue with this video is kind of multifaceted. But to start out with, I don't take a traditional view, theistically speaking, on materiality and substance, ontology, general ontology. I'm a form of anti-realist, a form of structuralist about reality. So I don't believe that the material world is fundamental. I reject dualism. I don't believe that there is kind of the material essence of reality, and then there's this spiritual essence or spiritual matter or whatever. I don't buy that. Various reasons. That's a different discussion for a different time. Back on track, Dan says he's an engineer. So I'm an engineer. I know what power is. It's an interesting statement. Power, as Dan defines it, is work, amount of work over time, and obviously the definition, therefore, he kind of works it out. It entails that anything that has power needs to be defined in terms of spatiality, because of work over time. He basically boils it down. I forget the exact equations he uses here. You could just watch the video. But basically boils it down to that you have it includes mass. It includes which obviously mass means materiality. It includes time, which obviously time, temporality, and then matter exists in space, it includes, spatiality, the concept. So it basically argues that the concept of power can only be applied to material beings, and obviously, or at least it couldn't be applied to non-material beings, because non-material beings are spaceless, and God also being non-temporal also would refute this as well. So to get to my responses, because I don't follow a traditional view, I don't think that timelessness or spacelessness, or their negations being temporal and spatial, are anything fundamental. So I do not believe that time exists in any. I believe that time is a mental construct, and like I said, I can't go into all these details. This isn't really the most important point, I think, but to kind of give you my initial response. When you're talking about power, work over time, what we're doing actually as humans is we are perceiving a particular structure of reality, interpreting it in a certain way, and then describing that in these quantitative methods of what we call time and what we call matter and what we call physical reality, et cetera, et cetera. And then deriving kind of equations to describe various actions and operations in them. Well, Dan, actually, in the comments section, people bring up, they said, hey, this isn't the only concept of power. There's, power of influence and that kind of thing. And Dan responds by saying that, one of his responses, at least, is he says, I agree with you that power does not have to mean physical work. For example, the power to persuade. But omnipotent, as it pertains to God, does include the concept of physical work, as in stopping the sun in the sky, for example. And thus, my video shows the folly of omnipotence. I also agree with you that there are many contradictions that arise, such as what you have pointed out. Thanks for your thoughts. That's in response to another commenter. The first part of that, the initial part of that, is what I is what I want to talk about here. It does include the concept of physical work. Well, my initial response is what we interpret as physical work is really the same thing. There's no problem. A dualist could respond to this and say, well, that has no problem. You could measure the relative power of a particular physical action of God by just calculating what we know. For instance, if God were to stop the sun, and a verse that talks about that, I think, is the interpretation that God literally stopped the sun is not plausible. But even if you take that view or whatever, you would have to say that the God, or a dualist could respond by saying that God, by acting upon reality, material reality, would be acting in a sense with an X amount of power. So, for instance, if God were to stop the sun, you could say, okay, calculating the speed of the sun from this particular frame of reference, the overall mass of the sun, really stopping the sun, in that sense would be something. But obviously you'd say, well, stopping the sun means actually stopping the Earth's rotation. And you could say, okay, well, the rotational speed of the Earth, its orbital speed around the sun, the mass of the Earth, yada yada yada. How much force would it take to stop the Earth, to slow it down to at a certain rate for a certain amount of time, or whatever? You could calculate all that out, and then you could say, thus, if God stopped the sun, stopped the Earth's rotation, God exercised X amount of power. It would take X amount of joules, to stop the Earth or whatever. So I don't see what's an issue about that. Just to say that concept of power could be applied to God, I don't see what's the problem with that. You could say it would take that amount of power. Now, you could bring up the interaction problem by saying that, well, how does God then, if he's material or temporal or non-temporal, whatever, immaterial, non-temporal, then how could he interact with things that are material and temporal? Well, that's one of the primary reasons why I reject dualism, in substance, is because I think that it leads to these problems with the interaction problem. But I mean, you could give a response like that and say, well, he just does somehow, and I know that Craig holds that God has become temporal at the moment of creation, so Craig would actually disagree and say God is temporal. God's not material and stuff, but I mean, Orthodox Christians believe that the person of Christ, one of the three, persons of the Trinity, incarnated into a physical presence as Christ on the earth, and therefore had a certain amount of, all those physical attributes constrained to a certain person in some way. It gets really complicated when you talk about incarnation, the theology of incarnation, that kind of thing. But back on track, my initial response is I don't believe in a dualistic world. So to say that this concept of power can't be applied to God, because I would say that the concept of power only has relevance in how we interpret a particular structure of reality. And because God all structures are an extension of God's mind intimately, they're the same substance, so God can interact with any structure in his own mind as easily as we can interact with any structure in our own mind by just, thinking of certain things, conceiving of one thing and another thing, blah, blah, blah. And so God can have intimate causal interaction with his own mind, obviously, because he is his own mind. And so there's no problem, basically, for this. I would just say that why can't power be applied to God? Well, it can, because the concept of power that we have here is intimately tied to how we interpret it, but basically it's like a category error. We're just misapplying particular, concept that we interact with God. That would be my initial response. Second response is if you're a dualist, I still think that you can, as an Orthodox Christian, it might not be plausible, but you could still argue that this concept of power can be applied to God. I personally take the idea of power and say that power, and in a basic sense, should be applied as one's scope of influence. And that sounds vague, but I think it lends itself well, because that will encompass different what we have conceptions of power. So, for instance, a material engineering perspective of power, like Mr. Courtney provided, would be one way of quantifying a particular entity's ability to influence, a scope of influence. So, for instance, if I said, what's the scope of influence of this particular internal combustion engine? You can answer it in one way of saying, well, I know that it can produce X amount of energy, X amount of work, it has X amount of power, whatever, however you want to put it, and say, therefore, its scope of influence could include anything that requires that amount of power or less. Obviously, it can't have an influence above that because it can't put it out enough power or do enough work to do that. Hopefully that doesn't sound too convoluted. But I can also say, well, what's the scope of influence? And then use it in a more qualitative method as well. I'd say scope of influence in a sense of like causal interaction. So, for instance, that internal combustion engine, if it's sitting in a warehouse in California, it can't influence anything over in Japan causally, because at least not directly, because it's just not there. It's not in the same location. So that's not necessarily a quantitative measurement, but it still includes a scope of certain things it can interact with and not. And obviously, having more power would mean your scope of influence is greater. And that can be registered or conceived of in all sorts of different ways, including the materialistic engineering way that or physicists, engineers, people like Mr. Courtney provided, but it also can include other concepts of what power and influence is, like political power and that kind of thing, scope of influence. That's why I take that definition of power to be what I would call power. So obviously, to say a being has maximal power, to touch on the omnipotence concept real fast before I run out of time, it would be to say that a being with maximal power would have the maximal scope of influence in every aspect you could chart it. So obviously, if God is a maximal being, you'd have maximal power, and maximal power could be defined as in all possible worlds and all possible scenarios, that being has more influence. The scope of influence is wider than any other entity, than any other being. And that would be, it basically encompasses all other scopes of influence. I apologize for any background noise, by the way, somebody's vacuuming now. But that basically is my initial response to Mr. Courtney's video. Thanks, everybody, for watching. Thank you, Mr. Courtney, for engaging, being willing to engage me in this dialogue. And hopefully we have some more fruitful conversation in the future here. Thanks. Beetle Man out.